The storm had been raging for hours. Rain hammered the thin roof of Jake Sullivan's small duplex like fists that would not let up, and the wind howled through every crack in the old window frames. Inside, the only light came from the kitchen, where a single lamp flickered over a stack of unpaid bills. Jake sat at the table, head in his hands, staring at the red letters stamped across the top of the electric bill, final notice. He was exhausted. Every month felt like climbing a mountain that only grew taller, no matter how hard he worked. His old pickup needed repairs, his landlord had already warned him about the rent, and the thought of saving enough money to fly across the country to see his children felt impossible. Then it happened. The sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the storm like a sound that didn't belong to the night. Jake froze, his chest tightening. At this hour, in weather like this, no one ever came knocking unless it was trouble. For a moment he considered ignoring it, just letting the storm drown it out. But the bell rang again, urgent, almost desperate. Jake pushed back from the table, every muscle tense. He walked slowly to the door, heart pounding harder than the rain outside. Peeking through the peephole, he expected the usual, a pushy neighbour, or worse. But instead he saw her. A young woman stood on his porch, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, arms wrapped around herself as the wind whipped behind her. She looked lost, frightened, and far too out of place for a street like Maple Avenue. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering on the chain lock. 100 thoughts rushed through his mind, scams, danger, the warnings he'd learnt the hard way. But then he saw her eyes through the blur of rain. Wide, trembling. The kind of eyes he knew too well because he had seen them in his little girl whenever a nightmare jolted her awake. And in that moment, caution gave way to something else, something deeper. He unlatched the chain. When Jake pulled the door open, the storm hit him like a wall. Rain swept across the porch, soaking his shirt in seconds, and the wind nearly tore the handle from his hand. The young woman stumbled forward, shivering so hard she could barely speak. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice breaking in the cold. "My car broke down about a mile back. I've been knocking on doors, but no one answered. I didn't know where else to go." Jake looked past her into the darkness. The street was empty, the rain making rivers along the curb. She wasn't carrying an umbrella. Her thin coat clung to her frame, and her shoes squelched with water. She looked like she had been walking for hours. "Come inside," Jake said quickly, stepping back to make room. The woman hesitated, as if she didn't want to impose, but the storm pushed her decision. She crossed the threshold, dripping onto his worn-out doormat. Jake shut the door behind her, shutting out the roar of the storm, and for a moment the silence inside felt heavy. The room was small, a little too dim, the wallpaper peeling in the corners. The old heater rattled in protest, doing its best to keep the chill away. Jake noticed how her eyes moved around, taking in everything. His second-hand couch, the faded family photos on the wall, the pile of bills still on the kitchen table. He felt a flash of embarrassment. "Here," he said, hurrying to the bathroom closet. He returned with a towel that had seen better days, but it was clean. "You're freezing." She took it with both hands, clutching it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, her lips still trembling. Jake nodded, unsure of what else to say. He found himself studying her face, the way her mascara had run in thin lines from the rain, the paleness of her cheeks, the fear that still lingered in her expression. Whoever she was, she didn't look like someone used to streets like this, or nights like tonight. "Do you want to sit?" he offered, motioning to the couch. "I'll make you something warm, cocoa maybe. It's not much, but it helps." Her eyes softened and she gave a small nod. That would be wonderful." Jake walked to the kitchen, reaching for the half-empty tin of cocoa powder he usually saved for when his kids visited. As he set a pot of milk on the stove, he couldn't shake the thought running through his head. Why had she ended up at his door, of all places? The rich smell of cocoa filled the small kitchen, a comfort Jake hadn't let himself enjoy in a long time. He poured the warm drink into a mismatched mug, the handle chipped but sturdy, and carried it to the living room. The young woman sat on the edge of his couch, wrapped in the towel he had given her, hands still trembling. "Careful, it's hot," Jake said as he handed her the mug. She cupped it tightly, letting the steam rise into her face. For the first time since she stepped inside, her shoulders relaxed just a little. She took a small sip and closed her eyes. "This is perfect. Thank you." Jake sat down in the old armchair across from her, unsure how much to ask. He didn't want to push, but he also couldn't ignore the questions swirling in his mind. Why was she here? Why was someone like her wandering a street like his on a night like this? "I'm Jake," he finally said, breaking the silence. She looked up at him over the rim of the mug. "Amanda?" Her voice was soft, almost careful. "Well, Amanda," he said with a faint smile, "you picked the worst night in the world to break down." That earned him a tiny laugh, quick and nervous, but real. "I know. My luck, right? The car just died on me and then the storm hit." Jake leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Where were you headed this late?" Amanda hesitated, staring down into the cocoa as if the swirl of liquid might give her the right answer. "Nowhere important," she said after a pause. "Just needed to get away for a while." Jake recognized the tone instantly. He had used it himself more times than he could count when people asked why his marriage ended or why he lived alone now. It was the voice of someone carrying a story they weren't ready to tell. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." For a few minutes, the only sound was the storm outside. Softer now, as if the worst of it had passed. Jake glanced at the family photos on the wall. His 2 kids, Danny and Sophie, smiling with missing teeth and messy hair. He wondered if Amanda had noticed them. She did. Her eyes lingered on one frame where Jake knelt beside a little girl with pigtails, both of them grinning at a pumpkin patch. "Your daughter?" she asked quietly. Jake cleared his throat, the familiar ache rising in his chest. "Yeah, that's Sophie, and my son, Danny. They live with their mom in Oregon." Amanda's expression softened. "You must miss them." "Every day," Jake said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Phone calls a couple times a week aren't the same as being there." Amanda looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes Jake saw something unexpected, understanding. "I get it," she whispered, "more than you know." Jake didn't ask what she meant. He just let the silence settle between them, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like the beginning of trust. Amanda set the empty mug on the coffee table, turning the chipped handle carefully so it wouldn't break. She drew the towel closer around her shoulders, her damp hair falling in loose strands against her face. For a long moment she just sat quietly, eyes fixed on the flickering lamp. "I used to hate storms," she said softly. "When I was little, I would hide under the covers until it passed. My dad would tell me there was nothing to be afraid of, but he never really understood. He was always busy, always providing, but not in the ways that counted." Jake listened, his chest tightening at the way her voice thinned on the last words. He recognized that ache. It was the same hollow feeling he carried every night without his kids. Amanda glanced at the family photos again. "You're lucky," she whispered. Jake almost laughed, a dry, humourless sound. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use. I only get to see them on holidays and summer breaks, when I can scrape together the money for a ticket. I miss birthdays, school plays, bedtime stories, even the small things like helping with homework or sitting down to dinner. I've missed years I'll never get back." His voice cracked. He rubbed a hand across his face, embarrassed by the tears burning behind his eyes. He wasn't used to saying it out loud. Amanda leaned forward, her voice steady in a way that surprised him. "But you're still trying. That matters, more than you realise." Jake swallowed hard, staring down at his rough hands. "Their mom says I cared more about building my business than building a family. And maybe she was right. I worked myself into the ground, chasing contracts, trying to give them everything. And by the time I realised what I was losing, it was too late. She left, took them with her." Silence pressed heavy in the room, broken only by the hum of the old heater. Amanda didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she whispered something Jake didn't expect. "My father was always around," she said. "But sometimes being around isn't the same as being there. I guess that's why hearing you talk about your kids meant so much. You don't just love them, you show it." Jake lifted his eyes. Amanda's expression was calm, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had been holding back for a long time. He didn't push for details. He just nodded slowly, because he understood. Absence didn't always come from distance, sometimes it came from being right there in the room and still choosing not to see you. Outside, the storm had begun to soften, the rain falling in steadier, quieter streams. Inside, two strangers sat in the glow of a flickering lamp, bound together by the simple truth that hurt is easier to carry when someone else is willing to hear it. The storm had finally spent itself by dawn. A pale light crept through the blinds, turning the living room into shades of grey and gold. Jake woke on the armchair, his back stiff from sleeping upright. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the night before had been real, until he saw Amanda, curled on the couch beneath a blanket, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. He let her rest. The house felt strangely full again, the quiet softened by the presence of another person. It reminded him of the mornings when his kids would crash on the couch after a movie night, their laughter still echoing in the air. By the time Amanda stirred, Jake was in the kitchen, frying the last 2 eggs from his fridge. The smell drifted through the small space, and she sat up slowly, blinking at the sunlight. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. Jake shrugged. "Figured you might want something warm before heading back to your car." "It's not much, just eggs and toast, but it beats starting the day on an empty stomach." Amanda smiled, the kind that carried more gratitude than words. "It's perfect." They ate together at the little kitchen table, mismatched plates between them. For a while they didn't talk much, just the clink of forks and the sound of the heater pushing against the morning chill. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary, and yet Jake felt a strange comfort in it. After breakfast he grabbed his keys. "Let's go take a look at your car." Amanda followed him out to the driveway, the air sharp with the clean scent that always follows heavy rain. Puddles shimmered along the cracked pavement as they climbed into Jake's old pickup, its engine coughing before it settled into a low rumble. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Amanda stared out the window, her reflection flickering across the glass. Jake kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't help noticing how out of place she seemed in his world, her posture, her clothes, the way she carried herself. She didn't look like someone who belonged on a back street lined with peeling paint and broken fences. When they turned the corner onto Cedar Avenue, Jake spotted the car immediately, sleek, black, shining even under the cloudy sky. It looked like it belonged in the parking lot of a high-end restaurant downtown, not abandoned in a rough part of town. Jake parked and popped the hood. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Amanda hovered nearby, nervous. "It just shut off last night, no warning." Jake leaned over the engine, his hands steady despite years of being out of practice. After a few minutes, he spotted the problem. "Your belt snapped. You'll need a tow. Not the worst thing in the world, but you won't get far driving it like this." Relief flickered across Amanda's face. "So it's fixable?" "Yeah," Jake said. "A shop can handle it. Shouldn't take too long." He reached for his phone. "I'll call a tow truck for you." Amanda hesitated, then touched his arm lightly. "You've already done so much. You didn't have to bring me here or feed me or any of this. I won't forget it." Jake looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of his own kids again, and how he'd pray for someone's kindness if they were ever stranded, cold and alone. "It's nothing," he said quietly. Anyone would have done the same. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The tow truck arrived not long after, its lights flashing against the wet pavement. Jake stood with Amanda at the curb while the driver hooked up the sleek black car. She crossed her arms against the chill, her damp hair now curling slightly in the morning air. "Looks like you're all set," Jake said, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. He tried to sound casual, but there was an odd heaviness in his chest. Strangers rarely left such a mark after only one night. Amanda nodded, her eyes following the truck as the driver tightened the last chain. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said. "If you hadn't opened your door, I don't know what I would have done." Jake gave a small shrug. "You would have figured something out. People are tougher than they think." Her smile was faint, tinged with something more than gratitude. "Maybe, but I don't think I'll forget last night." The driver waved them over, saying everything was ready. Amanda turned back to Jake, holding something in her hand. It was a business card, thick, embossed, the kind you didn't get from a corner print shop. "If you ever need anything," she said, pressing it into his palm, "call this number, please." Jake glanced at it briefly, but didn't linger. Amanda Sterling, the card read in neat letters, followed by a phone number he didn't recognise. He slipped it into his pocket without comment, uncomfortable under the weight of her sincerity. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, her blue eyes soft but steady. "That's why I mean it." She climbed into the cab of the tow truck, giving him one last look before the driver pulled away. Jake stood on the curb, watching the truck disappear around the corner until the street was empty again. The silence pressed in, broken only by the drip of rain from the trees and the distant hum of traffic. He looked down at his hand, at the faint imprint the card had left in his skin, and felt the house behind him waiting, quiet, lonely, exactly as it had been before the storm. Jake turned back inside, closing the door against the morning chill. The warmth from the night before was gone, replaced by the familiar ache of an empty home. He tossed the card onto the kitchen counter, meaning to forget about it. But even as he sat back down at the table, staring once more at the pile of bills, he realised the silence felt heavier than before. Because now he knew what it was like, just for a few hours, to not feel alone. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm Jake knew too well. He woke early, brewed the cheapest coffee he could buy in bulk, and sat at his drafting table in the corner of the living room, squinting at lines that blurred together after hours of staring. Freelance jobs trickled in, an addition to a storage unit, revisions for a diner remodel, but none of it came close to steady work. Every time he mailed an invoice, he calculated how long it might take to get paid, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. The landlord wasn't interested in excuses, only in dates circled on the calendar. Jake's stomach tightened each time he heard footsteps outside his door, half expecting the knock that meant a notice slipped under the frame. Evenings were worse. The silence of the house pressed on him like a weight. He tried filling it with the radio, sometimes with reruns of old shows, but nothing drowned out the ache of missing voices. His kids' laughter, the scrape of forks at dinner, the sound of Sophie begging for one more bedtime story. One night he called just to hear them. Danny answered, his voice deeper now, more grown than Jake remembered. They talked about school, about a new bike, about how he was getting good at soccer. Sophie chimed in for a minute, her words tumbling out in excitement, before their mum's voice in the background said it was time for bed. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, and when it ended, Jake sat staring at the dark screen of his phone, feeling as though the world had tilted out from under him. He rubbed at his chest, reached for the stack of bills, and tried to force himself back to work. His pencil scratched across paper, erasing and redrawing the same line 3 times. His eyes drifted, and that was when he noticed it. The card Amanda had left still sitting on the counter. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. The thick cardstock felt out of place in his worn-down kitchen. The name printed in bold letters reminded him of her eyes in the storm, the way her voice had steadied when she told him he mattered as a father. Jake set it back down. He wasn't the kind of man to call strangers for help. He wasn't even sure why he had kept it this long. But the house felt colder that night, and the silence stretched wider than usual, as if reminding him of the difference between loneliness and being truly seen. He pushed the card away and went back to his table. Life had to go on, even when it didn't feel like it. It was a Tuesday morning, grey and cool, the kind of day that promised rain without ever delivering it. Jake sat hunched over his drafting table, a pencil balanced between his fingers, sketching revisions for a small restaurant job that might cover next month's rent if the owner paid on time. The radio hummed low in the background, static mixing with a country song he wasn't really listening to. Then came the sound he least expected, the doorbell. He frowned, setting the pencil down. Deliveries almost never came this early, and neighbours usually knocked instead of ringing. His chest tightened with the old unease. Too many knocks had carried bad news. Jake stood slowly, brushing graphite dust from his hands, and walked to the door. Through the peephole he caught sight of someone that made his heart stutter. Amanda. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood an older man, tall, sharply dressed, his silver hair combed neatly back. The cut of his suit alone told Jake he didn't belong on Maple Avenue. Amanda's eyes caught the peephole, as if she could sense him there. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to calm someone bracing for impact. Jake unlocked the door and opened it. "Amanda?" Her smile widened just enough. "Hi, Jake." She stepped back slightly, gesturing to the man beside her. "This is my father." The older man extended his hand with a warmth that didn't match his expensive clothes. "Charles Sterling," he said. His voice was steady, confident, but not unkind. "You must be the man who opened his door on the worst night of the storm." Jake blinked, the words slow to sink in. His eyes moved between them, the young woman he'd given shelter to, and the man whose presence carried the kind of weight Jake usually only saw in courtrooms or corporate offices on television. Amanda's expression softened as she added, "I told him everything, about the storm, the cocoa, the way you listened, about how you helped without asking for anything." Jake's throat went dry. "I didn't. It was just one night. Anybody would have done it." Charles shook his head, still holding out his hand until Jake finally reached to shake it. "That's where you're wrong. Not everyone would have. 17 doors stayed shut that night before you answered. My daughter insisted I know the one that didn't." The words landed like a stone in Jake's chest. He thought back to that moment, standing at the peephole, the storm raging outside. How close he had come to walking away, to pretending he hadn't heard the bell. And now here she was again, standing on his porch in the clear light of day, bringing her father into the story he never expected to matter. Jake stepped back, still dazed. "Come in," he said quietly. Jake led them into the living room, suddenly aware of every flaw in the place, the peeling wallpaper, the stack of bills still scattered on the kitchen table, the old heater groaning in the corner. He wished, just for a moment, that he'd had time to make the house look less tired. But Charles Sterling didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He sat down comfortably on the couch, as if it were leather in a boardroom, while Amanda perched beside him, her eyes never leaving Jake. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "So, what brings you here? I mean, besides..." He gestured awkwardly toward Amanda. Charles leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "She told me you gave her shelter when no one else would. You fed her, you listened, and you asked for nothing in return. That matters to me." Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing down. "It was just a night. Anyone would have done the same." Amanda shook her head quickly. "No, Jake, that's the thing. They didn't. I knocked on door after door that night. People looked right at me through their windows and chose to turn away, but you didn't." The words hit harder than Jake expected. He remembered standing at the peephole, his hand on the lock, nearly convincing himself to walk away. He hadn't realised how close she'd been to giving up by then. Charles's gaze was steady. "It tells me something about you. Character shows up when no one's watching, and when there's nothing to gain. My daughter saw that in you, and after hearing her story, I wanted to see it for myself." Jake blinked, not sure how to respond. Compliments weren't something he heard often anymore. Mostly he heard demands: pay by the first, fix this mistake, why didn't you do better? He wasn't used to kindness being reflected back at him. "I'm no hero," he muttered. "I'm just a guy trying to keep the lights on." Charles gave a small smile. "That may be, but from where I'm sitting, you're more than that. You're someone who understands what really matters." Amanda leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "Jake, that night I told you my father was never really there. What I meant was... he was around, but distant. He gave me everything money could buy, but I never felt seen. When you spoke about Danny and Sophie, about fighting for them even when life was against you, that was the kind of father I always wished I had." Jake's throat tightened. The room felt heavier, like the truth of his struggles was suddenly on display for both of them to see. He wanted to tell them they didn't understand, that it wasn't as noble as it sounded, that most nights he felt like he was failing his kids, failing himself. But the way Amanda looked at him made him pause. Maybe she had seen something he couldn't. For a long moment, the three of them sat in the small living room, the hum of the heater filling the silence. Jake shifted in his chair, uneasy under the weight of their eyes. He had spent years trying to stay invisible, blending into quiet corners, avoiding questions. Now 2 people from a world far removed from his own were sitting in his home, treating him as if he mattered. Charles leaned back, his expression thoughtful. My daughter told me you used to be an architect. Jake froze, his stomach tightening. I did, a long time ago. Now I just take on drafting jobs when I can get them. Charles nodded. I looked at some of your old work. Amanda sent me a few things she found online. You have talent. Real talent. Jake's face burned. He wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or exposed. That was another life, he said quietly. I had a firm once. I poured everything into it and I lost my family in the process. I don't think about it much anymore. Amanda spoke softly, her voice steady. But you should, because it's still who you are. Charles studied him, his tone measured. I'm not here to hand you anything you haven't earned. That's not how life works, but my company takes on projects all over the state, and we are always looking for people who know what it means to build with purpose. Amanda was convinced I needed to meet you. After hearing your story, I think she was right. Jake stared at him, stunned. What are you saying? I'm saying I'd like you to take on some work for us, Charles replied. Not a gift, not charity, work. There's a community centre we're redesigning downtown. I want to see what you can do with it. If it goes well, maybe there's more after that. Jake's hands gripped the arms of his chair. The words sounded impossible, too good to be true. For years, doors had been slamming shut in his face, and now here was one opening without him even knocking. But doubt gnawed at him. Why me? You could hire anyone. Better architects, younger people who haven't been out of the game. Charles's eyes didn't waver. Because anyone can draw lines on paper, but not everyone understands what it means to lose, to rebuild, to know what people really need in the places they gather. Amanda told me you opened your door that night when you had nothing to gain. That tells me you build from something deeper than ambition. And that's the kind of person I want to work with. Jake swallowed hard, his chest tight. For the first time in years, someone wasn't dismissing him, wasn't seeing him as a failure. They were looking at him as if he still had something left to give. He glanced at Amanda. She gave a small nod, her eyes shining with quiet encouragement. Jake exhaled slowly, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. The words hung in the air long after Charles had spoken them. Jake sat frozen in his chair, staring at the floor as though the cracks in the old linoleum might give him the right answer. His throat felt tight and his hands trembled slightly on his lap. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that after years of scraping by, of being seen as nothing more than a man who had lost too much, someone finally saw his worth again. But another part of him, louder, sharper, kept whispering that it was too late. I don't know, Jake finally muttered. It's been years since I touched anything that big. I don't even know if I'm that guy anymore. Amanda leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. You are. I saw it that night. The way you talked about your kids, the way you cared. You haven't lost who you are, Jake. You've just buried it under everything life threw at you. Charles nodded slowly. It's natural to doubt yourself. I've seen brilliant people walk away from their own talent because failure convinced them they had nothing left to give. But the truth is, failure isn't the end. It's proof you tried. And trying again is the only way forward. Jake rubbed his hands over his face. What if I let you down? Charles's reply came steady, without hesitation. Then you learn and you keep going. That's all any of us can do. The room went quiet again. Jake's gaze drifted to the framed photos on the wall. Danny's missing teeth, Sophie's pigtails. He thought about their voices on the phone, about Sophie asking when he would visit next. He had given them excuses too many times. Maybe this was the chance to finally change that. He let out a long, shaky breath. All right, I'll try. Amanda smiled, and for the first time since the storm, Jake felt a spark of warmth in his chest that wasn't burdened by regret. Charles stood and offered his hand again, his grip firm. That's all I ask. We'll start small and we'll see where it goes. But something tells me this is only the beginning. As they left that afternoon, Jake walked them to the door, still dazed. When the latch clicked behind them, he leaned against it, staring into the quiet of his little home. Only this time, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. For the first time in years, it carried the faintest trace of hope. The following week, Jake found himself walking into an office he never thought he'd see again. It wasn't his own firm, long gone with the divorce and the debts, but a bustling floor filled with younger architects and designers tapping away at computers, sketches pinned on walls and models spread across long tables. He carried only a worn leather portfolio tucked under his arm, the same one he'd once brought to pitch meetings years ago. Charles had arranged for him to meet with a small team on a community centre renovation project. It wasn't glamorous, no high-rise towers, no luxury developments, but it mattered. A place for kids to study after school, for families to gather, for seniors to feel less alone. The kind of work that touched people's lives in ways blueprints usually couldn't. At first, Jake felt out of place. The others spoke quickly, rattling off design software shortcuts and construction terms with the ease of people who had never stepped away. His own laptop was so old it took nearly 10 minutes just to boot. He caught one of the younger men giving him a skeptical glance, and for a moment the shame returned like a weight pressing on his chest. But then he opened his portfolio. The sketches inside were done by hand, pencil and ruler, the way he had learned decades ago. Lines clean, proportions balanced, a touch of human warmth in every corner. As he spread them on the table, the chatter in the room softened. One by one, heads leaned closer. Someone muttered, "These are really good." And for the first time in years, Jake felt the old confidence stir. He spoke up, his voice steadying as he explained how the space could be opened to bring in more light, how the design should reflect not just walls and floors but the community that would use it. The words flowed easier than he expected, like muscle memory. When the meeting ended, Charles caught his eye from the doorway. He hadn't said a word during the presentation, just watched. Now he gave Jake a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "I told you so." Walking back to his truck that evening, portfolio under his arm, Jake felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not relief, not even pride. It was purpose. The same purpose that had once driven him to build a business from nothing, before he lost sight of why he was doing it. Only now, it was clearer. He wasn't chasing success for its own sake. He was trying to rebuild a life where his kids could look at him and see more than the man who failed. That night, in his quiet house, Jake spread the sketches on his kitchen table. The bills were still there, but for once they didn't feel like the whole story. The paychecks didn't feel big, not compared to the money he once brought home when his firm was alive, but they were steady. And steady was something Jake hadn't known in years. The first time he deposited one, he stared at the slip for a long while, almost afraid it would disappear if he blinked. He used the money carefully. He paid down the electric bill before the red notices piled up. He caught up on rent, slipping an envelope into his landlord's hand and watching the man's eyebrows lift in quiet surprise. He even bought groceries, without counting every dollar, filling his fridge with more than eggs, bread and coffee. For the first time in months, the kitchen shelves looked less like a bachelor's survival and more like a home. At night he kept working. He spread sketches across the table where bills used to crowd out his every thought. The heater still rattled, the wallpaper still peeled, but now there was a kind of hum inside the house, an energy that hadn't been there before. He started putting aside a little each week. At first it was only a few dollars, tucked into an envelope labelled Oregon. But the envelope grew thicker, and with it, so did his hope. Each time he slipped in another bill, he pictured Sophie's smile, Danny's laugh, the sound of them running down the hall toward him. The phone calls with his kids felt different too. He could hear it in his own voice when he told them about his new project. For the first time in years, he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't apologising for what he couldn't do. He was telling them about something he was building, something they could be proud of. One evening after hanging up, he caught himself smiling at the empty room. It startled him. Smiles had been rare, usually reserved for those short minutes when his kids' voices were in his ear. But now it lingered, warm and real, even after the call ended. Jake still had miles to go, debts, custody hurdles, a life to piece back together, but for the first time since the divorce, the future didn't feel like a wall closing in. It felt like a door he was inching open, one sketch, one paycheck, one saved dollar at a time. The house grew quiet after Jake's children went to bed, their soft laughter fading into the safety of dreams. Jake cleared the cups from the table, while Amanda and Charles lingered in the living room. The old lamp cast a golden circle of light, and for the first time all day, Charles looked less like the polished man of business and more like a father carrying years he couldn't put down. Amanda sat across from him, her fingers loosely entwined, as if gathering courage. "Dad," she said gently, "I need to say this while I can. You were there, yes. You made sure I had schools, clothes, a house that looked perfect from the outside. But when it came to being present, really present, I felt like you weren't with me. I needed your eyes, your time, not just your name on a check." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. Charles's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. Finally, he exhaled. "I thought I was doing right by you. I thought giving you comfort would prove my love, even if I wasn't the man sitting at the piano for recitals or standing in the bleachers at games. I told myself I was providing and that it was enough." Amanda's eyes glistened. "But it wasn't enough for me. I wanted to hear your voice in the audience. I wanted to see your face in the crowd. I wanted you, Dad, not just the things you gave." The words seemed to land like stones in his chest. He looked at her, really looked, as if realising how much of her childhood he'd missed in the name of responsibility. For the first time, his confident posture faltered. Jake lingered in the doorway, unsure if he should excuse himself. But Charles spoke, his tone low and worn. "I can't rewrite the years, but I can tell you this, I see it now, and I don't want to waste what's left. If you'll let me, Amanda, I'll try to be here, the way you always needed me to be." Amanda leaned forward, tears slipping down her cheeks, but there was no anger in them, only release. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tight, as though holding on to the father she had longed for. Jake stepped back quietly, giving them the space they needed. In his chest, something softened. Maybe tonight wasn't about broken people finding perfection. Maybe it was about broken people daring to start again. By the time autumn rolled around, the air had turned crisp and the leaves along Maple Avenue burned in shades of gold and red. Jake's project on the community centre was nearly complete, and for the first time in years he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. But what he looked forward to most wasn't the blueprints on his desk, it was Thanksgiving. Amanda had called weeks earlier with an invitation. "My father insists," she'd said with a laugh, "and so do I. Bring your kids if you can, it wouldn't be the same without you." It took every dollar of his savings envelope, but Jake bought the plane tickets. When Danny and Sophie burst through his front door, dragging their small suitcases, he nearly dropped to his knees from the weight of joy in his chest. Their voices filled the house, the emptiness chased away by the sound of children who had missed him as much as he had missed them. On Thanksgiving Day, they drove together to the Sterling home. The house was large, sprawling across a quiet street lined with old trees. Jake felt out of place as he parked his aging truck in the driveway among polished cars. But then Sophie slipped her hand into his, and the nerves eased. Inside, warmth and the smell of roasted turkey wrapped around them. Amanda greeted them at the door, pulling Sophie into a hug and ruffling Danny's hair like she'd known them all her life. Charles followed, shaking Jake's hand firmly before clapping him on the shoulder. "Welcome, son," he said simply. The dining room table stretched wide, covered in dishes that glowed under the light. Stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet rolls, pies. Jake sat between his children, watching them laugh as Amanda helped Sophie reach for cranberry sauce, while Charles told Danny stories about building things that last. For a while, Jake just sat quietly, taking it in. The sound of voices blending together, the easy way everyone belonged, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. He thought back to that stormy night, the rain, the knock, the moment he almost didn't answer the door, and he realised how close he had come to missing all of this. When dessert was served, Amanda raised her glass. "To kindness," she said softly, "to doors opened, to second chances and to family, however it finds us." Jake lifted his glass too, his throat tight. Across the table, Danny and Sophie grinned up at him, and he knew they were proud. The house glowed with laughter long into the evening, And when Jake finally tucked his kids into bed that night, he whispered a silent prayer of thanks, not just for the food or the warmth, but for the reminder that sometimes the smallest act, opening your door to a stranger, can change everything. Love is not measured by what we give in money or things, but by the time, presence, and care we choose to share. It is never too late to show up for the people who matter. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. I'm truly grateful for your time. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you again soon here on Rain Inside.